Welcome to the New Age Masonic Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the New Age magazine, predecessor to the Scottish Rite Journal. On this podcast, we take a deep dive into the articles of the history, people, and lessons of Freemasonry as written in the New Age magazine and their pertinence to both everyday, personal, and Masonic life. Hosted by brothers Maynard Edwards, 33rd degree, Matt Bowers, 32nd degree, and Chris Ruley, 32nd degree KCCH. Articles from the New Age magazine read by Matt Bowers and brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. Welcome to the New Age Masonic Podcast, brought to you by the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. I am your host, Matt Bowers, 32nd degree, alongside with brother
Hello,
Chris Ruley, 32nd degree, KCCH, author, historian, archivist for the Valley of DC. Do we need to add more to your name? Stop it.
I'm just a 32nd degree KCCH, man. I'm not.
Okay.
I'm just a
leave,
guy.
I'll leave all that stuff in there though, just to irritate you. But
Yeah.
But we're kind of like a two-piece without a biscuit today, because we don't have illustrious Maynard Edwards, 33rd degree.
That's right. We don't. No, he's busy off doing things. As we're recording this, there's a second leadership conference, Scottish Rite conference, that is coming up. So he's busy doing those, and so we decided to tackle this article ourselves.
Yes, we did. And hopefully just the two of us do it. Well, I know one of us will do it justice, and it ain't me. So it'll certainly be you. And
you picked a good one. You picked a really relevant one, I think.
I you know what? I would based on the conversation we just had a moment ago, I would certainly say that. And today's article from the New Age Masonic magazine, which for those of you that don't know is the predecessor to the Scottish Rite Journal.
That's right.
First published, what year was it again, Chris? 1904?
The first, yes, yeah, 1904.
1904. And this one is from the May 1992 edition, titled Masonic Ego, and it was written by illustrious John W. Dean III, who was the imperial potentate of the Shrine of North America at the time.
Right.
And this wasn't one that would normally jump out at me. I've sent articles to both Chris and Maynard that are certainly of a more questionable nature, and this one is a little safer. So
is it? Well, I think.
You know what? It's funny that you say that. Is it a little safer? Is somebody, because certainly in the middle of this, you'll hear my reading of it, and it could certainly, it might ruffle a feather or 12. What do you think?
Yeah, I also want to, you forgot to mention the byline for this, which was Masonic Ego, and then the subtitle, the byline would be Positive or Negative Force. And so I think, why don't you go ahead and read the article, and let's get back into it and we can talk about it.
Okay, well, here's my reading of the article from the May 1992 edition of the New Age magazine. In March 1950, I was entered into my first Masonic Light in Frankfurt Lodge number 292 of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This was the beginning of my Masonic education and experiences. During the next 40 years, I observed, learned, worked, held office, conferred all 3 Blue Lodge degrees, and arrived at certain conclusions about our beloved fraternity and its appendant and concordant bodies. The first conclusion I reached was that change comes slowly not because our leadership at the top cannot envision it, but because our past officers are resistant and suspicious of change. The second conclusion is that we have allowed the quality of our membership to decline. There are so many reasons for this development that I shall not attempt to address them here. This decline in quality has resulted at all levels in less tolerance for instruction of the membership and often friction between the bodies. It has always been a fact that as the quality of leadership declines, the tendency to show authority increases. This means the leader has allowed his ego to get out of reasonable control. I know that it is difficult for many of our brethren to accept the fact that they are egotists. However, I would point out to all my brethren that ours is an ego-driven organization. If it were not for ego, we would have no leaders. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, and all the leaders of the world have been egotists. The secret to fraternal brotherhood is controlling one's ego. We have, from time to time, experienced frictions between some of our members and some of our Masonic bodies. A good many of these have been the result of someone defending what he believes to be his authority, his turf. It is when this happens that we must all step back and examine our positions. In all of our Masonic bodies, we have an altar where each of us has learned his lessons of brotherhood, love, tolerance, and relief. At this same altar, we all took an oath to place an arm around a brother and give him due and timely notice of all approaching problems or dangers. Every Masonic body adopts rules for the orderly transactions of the lodge, chapter, council, commandery, Scottish Rite body, shrine, grotto, forest, etc. These rules are known by different names, but regardless of its name, it should be kept in mind that its purpose is to help us run and promote our fraternity. If any individual Mason or Masonic group causes friction and disharmony, then the situation should be changed from within the ranks of the relevant group, since its leaders or members are not serving the purposes for which the group exists. I have observed that some of our bodies, at all levels, have gotten so wrapped up in their rules that they have forgotten the teachings that we learned at the altar. I pose the questions from time to time. Am I worshiping the rules and forgetting the lessons of Freemasonry? Is what I am doing because of my ego? Is my action consistent with our Masonic teachings? Brethren, I submit to you that existing problems are not problems between the bodies, but problems between individuals, problems that could be healed and totally eliminated if we read our rules correctly, consistently, and with our fundamental Masonic principles in mind. Too often, however, the one problem blocking the way to harmony and progress is ego. If we ask these questions of ourselves before we act, I wonder how much disharmony there would be. In my opinion, there would be little or none. Rather, as spelled out in the rituals of all bodies, we would see what can be accomplished when good men strive together with no contention, except the noble contention, or rather emulation, of who best can work and best agree. All right, we're back at it. Myself and brother Chris Ruley, the two-piece minus the biscuit, illustrious Maynard Edwards. I'm just going to keep saying that so he hears this, and I'll refer to him as the biscuit every time I see him.
He's going to be the biscuit. Yeah, there you go.
He's the biscuit. So what was your take on this article there, brother Chris?
Okay, so whenever reading these articles, regardless of when in the New Age these are, I always appreciate the context of when they were given. And so a little bit of the context of this article was that illustrious brother John W. Dean, who at the time, as you said before the break, he was the imperial potentate for the shrine. Dean presents this, or actually, this is a speech that he makes during what we call the Grand Masters Conference. It was actually the Frank S. Land Breakfast during the Grand Masters Conference, which at the time and for many years, now it travels all around the country every year. But for many years, it's certainly during the beginning of this session, it would often be held in Washington, D.C. or around Washington, D.C. Like in this example, 1992, it was in the Hyatt Regency in Virginia. And so he was making this speech, or this speech was for Grand Masters, right? So this was his remarks to the Grand Masters who were visiting for the conference. And I think, from that perspective, I think it gives us a little bit more insight into what he's trying to say. On one side, Dean is trying to say ego is helpful in certain situations.
Sure.
There's a line that he says here: if it not were for ego, we would have no leaders like George Washington, Franklin, and Paul Revere. Now, what is he trying?
And that's something that I can't, not to interrupt you, I apologize.
Yeah, go ahead.
That I wanted to touch upon, because there are two words in our language that often have a negative connotation, and one of them is ego. And like you said, if it weren't for ego, we wouldn't have these leaders. Much like the word, to me, discipline often has a negative connotation. Whenever you hear someone say about their kid that's acting up, that kid needs some discipline, somebody automatically thinks you need to whack the kid, in the head, or, corporal punishment, anything like that. Whereas discipline really is just a routine. It's just a way. It doesn't necessarily have to be negative, like the art, what was stated just a moment ago.
That's right. That's right. And I think we come to when we read things, when we engage with brother Masons or with non-Masons, not even sometimes, we always bring in our perceptions, our personal biases, our past experiences to every conversation. And that really forms and modes how we engage with our brothers. And so Brother Dean's argument here is, in certain cases, ego is helpful. Certainly, we can see examples of Washington, Franklin, and Paul Revere who were leaders, and he claims, are egotists,
Right.
everybody
Right.
else. Now, what his argument, I think, his lead of the argument is, hey, we're having, there's a problem here with ego, and there's a problem that he is seeing across the entire fraternity, not just the Shrine or the Scottish Rite or the York Rite. He's seeing this across. And he's also saying that there's this decline in quality, right? So
that jumped out at me too. A decline in the quality of membership. Was there anything in particular that changed in terms of membership back in the early 90s or late 80s, early 90s?
Well, here's the thing about that, though, is that's a case that's been always made. And not always, but what I'm trying to say is, if you go back into newspapers, periodicals, even in the 18th century, 19th century,
right,
in older 100 or 50 years ago, there are periodicals where Masons have op-eds that say, oh, we should have done it. The times are changing, things are declining in quality. Gee whiz, look at the things in the past were always the best. And so this sort
kind
of
of like back in my day when I went to school, uphill both ways.
That's right.
Shoveled snow.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so he goes, well, the first conclusion is things are changing. Things change slowly. Things don't change rapidly. And I think one of his things is like, look, I mean, you might have an ego or a bad ego if you think that you're able to become a leader of a fraternal organization and then change things immediately within your small period of time. Quite frankly, change occurs very slowly, and especially in a large organization, things change slowly. And then this whole idea of diminishing quality. The fact of the matter is, this statement or this argument has been made for 100 plus 50 years.
Oh yeah, it never changes. You think of the generation that fought and served during World War II, the greatest generation. People. Right. The generation after that say, "Oh, they're no good." Or when we did that interview with a brother who wrote an article about Gen Z could really use some love from Freemasonry.
That's right. That's right.
Could come to that same conclusion with that.
Right. And mind you, Gen Z, the generation who has, quite frankly, I would argue, they were brought up on the internet a lot. Mm-hmm. Faster than at least you and I were brought into. Yeah. So they have access to the world's resources, history's resources, in a blink of an eye a lot sooner than we did. I think you and I, and perhaps brothers who are listening to the podcast, for example, in high school or college, when we needed to do a book report or something, we had to go physically to a library. And, the internet, at least when I was getting into college, the internet was becoming a thing where professors were just starting to talk about how to access resources online. And so I think in a generation that has certainly access to the entire world, our history of resources, how do we engage with that? Well, that's the same point. How do we engage, like what Dean is saying in this article? How do we engage with this declining quality? So he says, for example, this decline in quality has resulted in less tolerance for instruction, which is really interesting, and friction between the bodies. So in other words, he's saying this decline in quality means all these guys aren't really learning. They're not getting an education. They're not getting the education perhaps that he received or perhaps his generation received.
not to interrupt,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd have to push back on him with the what was it, the quest for knowledge type of thing. You
Yeah,
know, as a catechism instructor for the Master Mason degree in my Blue Lodge,
sure.
you know, running the gamut of brothers, you know, age 18, literally age 18 to well into their 70s, they
Yeah,
all had, I would push back on him on that one greatly if I were sitting in front of him, because these guys are all wanting to know what this means.
right.
They're all asking questions at any given point. You know, we'd be in the middle of trying to memorize something, and they were like, "What is this? What is this part about?
That's right.
Why
That's
does
right.
this come up?" So it's strange to think that he would have that opinion when, you know, in my experience, it's not like a bunch of slackers sitting there going, "Gosh, I have to memorize all this." Really?
Yeah, yeah. I think what happens is, and I can't really certainly speak to I can't speak to, the grand commanders, the potentates of the world who
Right.
are, very high up in the leadership. But what I can see is if you are interested in going into leadership, let's say you're wants to even serve as worshipful master. I think as you go up the chairs in a progressive line, or perhaps you don't have a progressive line and you just are initiated and elected into your office as master in a couple of years, the idea is sometimes, and perhaps brother might see this, sometimes you are focusing less on the ritual and focusing more on the administrative, the structural, the process. We have a meeting next week and I've got to figure out. And so I'm spending more time as worshipful master getting all my ducks in a row, and you really lose the thing that you got into masonry in the first place, which was all that ritual, that instruction, that education. And so I can certainly understand from a leadership perspective is as you go up an executive position, you sometimes, not saying all the time, you
Right.
sometimes lose those opportunities to just sit down with brothers and chat about the ritual and talk through it and that instruction. You may not necessarily have the time to sit with a brother 18-year-old or up to 70 to
Well,
go through that and take it.
couldn't that also be the part of ego that you're not taking the time to figure out how to put, you know, because any strong leader doesn't just do that, just doesn't do everything by themselves.
Absolutely.
So wouldn't it boil down to more, you don't have the skill set as a leader to put the right people in the right places to handle those types of things, so you can handle what you find to be as equally important, if not more.
Yes, and I think when there's a lack of discipline, there is an increase in what Dean is calling the ego, the
Right.
idea of like, I will just do this myself. If there was a set of discipline, if the brother, or let's say the leader, let's just call him leader, was more disciplined about what it means to be a leader, about engaging with your people you work with or you engage with, really delegating versus taking it on yourself,
Well,
then
that's
then I think you would become a successful leader if you're able to delegate and engage and really lead others, not necessarily do it yourself.
well, that's what I've so that's something I've experienced being an observer. I've had some, I've been around some, and we all have, and maybe some of us just don't pay attention to it. But I've been around some really good leaders in my life, you know, even before Masonry, guys that I worked with and when I was in
Sure,
music retail. And it was
sure.
funny to see the attitude between the type of leader that did everything as
Hmm.
opposed to the type of leader that delegated everything.
Right.
It was really interesting, you know, the nine times out of ten, in my experience, the leader that did everything had a bit of a disdain for the guy that delegated. Which, when you delegate and you share ownership of something, in my opinion,
Right.
you build up your bench far greater for when it's your time to step down.
Right. 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 That's
That
right. Right.
that was always my experience, as opposed to the guy that did everything and then he would hit that point of frustration because somebody didn't know how to do something. Well, you didn't put it in their hands to do
That's right.
something and let them fail. You know, nobody it's masonry. We're not, as a guy that I used to work with once said, you know, we're not birthing and burping babies here.
Yeah, but I think there is if you choose, by the way, if you choose to be a leader, if you choose to be a leader in masonry, that is to say you occupy a chair, you go up the line, perhaps you go into a grand lodge line or a grand body line. I think there are certain expectations of you and things that you're supposed to do and things that you should do as a leader. But what is the end goal? The end goal is to facilitate better understanding, better entertainment, better enjoyment, and to really have the people around you learn a little bit more and have the organization grow. And I think we have to find a way, leaders, good leaders have to find a way of striking a balance between I am energetic, I am eager to serve as a leader and lead and do XYZ versus I'm a leader, I need to engage with my group of co-leaders or officers, strike a balance, discipline, doll out those suggestions, I
Mhm.
identify what the strategy is. Unfortunately, we make this claim, but in certain cases, it doesn't really happen some years where we say we're going to create a strategy and we're going to stick to that strategy or plan. And so good leadership really is about being disciplined, about staying in that strategy, identifying what the strategy is, communicating that strategy with your team, getting buy-in from everyone, and then executing on that strategy as best as you can, but not just by yourself, with everyone there.
Sure.
And when that doesn't happen, and this is what Dean is saying, when that doesn't happen, when we don't bring everyone into those types of conversations, when we decide, I'm just going to do it myself because it's faster, it's easier,
Right.
it's whatever to do it myself, that is the ego coming into play. Not necessarily all the time. In certain times the leader has to do this because or has
Sure.
to be alone because perhaps there's an institutional issue that's causing everyone to not go a certain way. So I mean, obviously we're all speaking, by the way, very generally in this article. This article is
Right.
only 2 pages.
Yeah, it's
this
pretty short.
it's pretty short. It was intended for leaders who are already leaders right now, right? Because it's a leadership conference, or I'm sorry, the Grand Masters conference.
Hmm.
So I think there's a lot there. Um,
Well,
I
how was it received? Is there any word on how his
I'm
that
not
speech?
sure.
Not sure.
It
Okay.
doesn't say,
Doesn't
unfortunately.
say. Yeah.
Yeah. But I would say
Yeah, we didn't have a jot form survey
that's
to
right.
dole
That's
out to get word back.
that's right. I will say there's a lot more as and don't even folks don't even have to listen to me. They can listen to the article that you've done a good job at, recounting, but he doesn't necessarily give us instructions. He doesn't
Sure.
necessarily say, here's how you remedy this. It's just identifying the problem. It's discussing the problem. And
Well,
sometimes,
couldn't you say that's the point he was making of masonry, that you have to do the work to correct the problem
yeah, and
in sort of an indirect way, maybe?
sure, but I think in general, I would have preferred if he provided some guidance on how would you like what do you what I mean, what are his thoughts on what's the best way to do that? Is it just ego? He doesn't really say what to do. He just basically identifies the problem and acknowledges that there is a problem.
Right.
Then saying, well, we have to find a way of being more harmonious and, breaking away from any disharmony.
So
Great.
could
How would you do
somebody
that?
say could somebody say with that article maybe his the negative aspects of his ego, and I'm using ego in terms of just leadership and confidence and stuff like that.
Right,
Maybe
right.
one of the negative aspects of his ego was lack of communication, because that's something that I've certainly seen with ego in the negative sense. It typically comes from a lack of clear communication.
I think being a good communicator is tantamount or important or a foundational pillar, excuse me, of being a good leader. I think if
Sure.
you're not able to communicate well, communicate with others, then you inherently are not as great as a leader as you could be.
Well, and more importantly too, especially when you're not speaking to a group and you're breaking it down to, you know, groups of people less and less and less, each person's how you deal with people, you have multiple levels with how you deal with them. You know,
Right.
I'm the type of guy that you can hurl every expletive in the world at me and tell me what I'm doing wrong. And I'll be like, okay, it doesn't hurt my feelings. Whereas you have that guy or that woman, for that matter, that you have to sit down with and really think through what you're going to say. And to a large degree, put your ego to the side
Yeah,
and be the better communicator to
that's right.
what needs to change.
That's right. Well, and in the article, Dean even says, listen, in order to fix this, or in order to remove ego or bring the negative connotation of ego down, remember what we did. All of us as Masons, leaned on an altar, and there were certain obligations that we went through, that obligatory initiatic experience. And he makes the argument of like, well, it's pretty easy, guys. Go back to what our obligations were
Hmm.
and listen to those obligations and repeat those obligations and commit yourselves to applying good leadership with those principles that you've inculcated. So I think it's there. I've heard that so many times from Masonic leaders and bodies to say, well, just go back to our ritual and go back to and I think absolutely that's true. But then not just that, I think there's another step in that process, which is, as a leader, show us that example while you were doing it. So in other words, yes, thank you. I appreciate you acknowledging, but why don't you walk the walk as well as talking the talk? And so,
Well, and one way I actually see that
yeah,
is oddly enough every Monday when Brother Maynard puts out his Monday Morning Masonry,
that's right.
when he gets into that role of doing it weekly, and granted it's 99.9% anecdotal, which as well it should be. If you're well thought out every week, then good for you, I guess. But when he does that, that is a really good way of demonstrating better leadership qualities each and every week,
Yeah.
I think.
And by the way, anecdotes are helpful for people
Sure.
to use as an examples, and say, oh, that's just an anecdote. Sure, but at the same time, that's how we communicate. That's how human beings communicate. We communicate through storytelling. We communicate through highlighting things that have happened to us. And
Yeah.
then that allows us to think critically and say, oh, that has happened to me in the past, or how have I felt that way? Or it may have not been the same location, different place, a different time, but the same problem, the same principles. And so, perhaps if you boil it down, Matt, I think perhaps what Dean's article is very good at is perhaps as a leader acknowledging those issues and being acknowledged, not acknowledging those issues as a problem. So acknowledging, hey, listen, we have an institutional ego problem. Perhaps not everyone, but what ego is coercive, and in the negative context of ego is coercive. And so in this example, he dedicated time out of his, he had perhaps 5 or 6 minutes to do this talk. And
Hmm.
so what he decided to do was acknowledging that ego is important, and uh, it is a powerful force in terms of leadership or with regard to leadership.
It's interesting too how accomplishment can positively and negatively impact your ego. It
Yes,
can blow your head so out of proportion because you did this, or you're constantly going I, as
that's
opposed
right.
to focusing maybe more. And and maybe if you were a little bit more of a delegating type of leader, to say we, you know.
Perfect. I'm so glad you mentioned that. Yeah. I mean, if you spend all of your time saying I did X or I did Y, well, this fraternity is a group organization. None of
Yep.
this stuff gets done internally or,
Yep.
or individually, rather.
Right.
Everything here is part of a group. Now, the great part about it is that we as a collective are coming together to provide initiatic experience to one individual.
Right.
And that initiatic experience is inherently singular. It's for you. In other words, I can't go into your brain during the initiatic process, during the EA degree or whatever, and understand what you're going through.
Hmm.
But as part of the fraternity, as part of that initiation, you are brought into a family or a fraternity. Then our goal is to bring in other guys to have them experience that same thing that we experience. And that experience was a positive experience, that it was an impactful experience. And that's why we do these types of things, to do that. And so in that sense, that ego is actually driven towards supporting and to engaging
Yeah.
new guys, and the fact that you mentioned that you like to do ritual, study and ritual practice and catechism practice with others, that in itself is an ego thing because it's you delegating and saying, oh, not delegating, excuse me, it's you taking yourself out and saying, I want to share this with others. I think it's important for others to learn this, and therefore I'm doing it. So again, it's that, like Dean says, it's
Yeah.
a positive or a negative force. It can be both. It should be both. In life, there's balance, and so there should be a little mix of good and bad. And so we can't be all on one side, but
Right.
it's good that there's a little bit of a balance.
Yeah, I heard a good quote today from someone. A person was quoting someone else. This particular quote was coming from someone who sounds much more like an ego-less, for lack of a better term, leader when they said, "I can do whatever I wanted. I could do whatever I wanted if I didn't want credit. Like I'm giving everyone else the credit,
Yeah.
so I can just I can move away and just kind of, stay out of the light of everything that's going on and move on to the next
Yeah.
good thing."
Yeah. There was a past Grand Master in my jurisdiction who I really liked how he engaged with people when he gave speeches or when
Hmm.
there was a public moment to speak. He would often dedicate most of his time to acknowledging the good work that others were doing. And I found that very interesting. It wasn't, there are some grandmasters who would provide an interesting educational anecdote. They might provide something about themselves and say, hey, listen, when I was Mason or when I joined, they'll provide something personal. And
Right.
then this grandmaster, I never forget it because I've only seen it a couple times, but he was such an expert at, like, let's say if you're the worst master of your lodge,
Hmm.
he'd go around the room and say, brother so and so, great Matt, great job organizing this. This was great. Brother John, thanks for the food. Brother so and so, great job, blah blah
Yeah.
blah, great program. He went out of his way to acknowledge everyone else, and he would very rarely comment about what he was doing. And in a sense, that sort of speaks also to the role of an executive leader. Is the executive leader there to just do everything and take the credit, or is he there to share the credit with everyone who was there that did the work?
Yeah.
Or in this Grandmaster's example, he removed himself from that completely, and it was just like, you guys are doing a great job. I'm here just to help you guys and support if there's anything I need. It's really your show. I thank you for acknowledging me and having me visit here, and thanks for letting me, talk for a little bit, but really you guys are doing all the work. And
Right.
so I think everyone has a different personality, certainly. You may not necessarily fit in that category, but as you become a leader, you must recognize how ego plays into your role as a leader.
For sure. Yeah, and get out of your own way, especially
That's right.
because that could be far more detrimental than anything.
Yeah.
Far more, far more. I would have like. I wish I could have. It's funny when the year that this article came out, I was, let's see, 19. I was nine. Yeah, I was 19 years old. I'm curious how my 19-year-old self would have thought of that article as opposed to my 50-year-old self now.
Where were you? You said you were in high school?
No, I was graduated from high school. I was
Oh, excuse
19.
me,
Yeah,
college. College.
yeah. No, no. Let me correct you on that. I attempted college. When people say that they went to college but they never graduated, I'm like, no, I attempted college and I was
Nice.
not good at
Oh,
it.
there it is. There, and you know what? That is its own sense of acknowledging that you're not following, a certain standard, and I think that's appropriate as well.
Well, I wish things would have been a little easier, maybe a little simpler than they turned out. But that's maybe another article I can find down the road and read
Yes,
as well.
time. That's right. Well, time is one of the great healers and benefactors of good thinking. It allows you to take a step back and think. And I think we would all look back at maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and
Hmm.
think about where we were in our lives. And perhaps we'd all be pleased and happy that where we are now in our lives, we have a lot more insight
Oh yeah.
than, 10 years, 20 years ago.
And with this article, getting back to his second conclusion, Dean's second conclusion with the decline in membership,
Yeah.
I would think we're positioned for a not a decline in membership, but a better opportunity for membership just because of the ease of information out there.
Yes, I think well, here's the thing about declining a membership, because I do a lot of data, or I run a lot of data for work and for some special projects for the Supreme Council.
Yeah,
Um, you know, we shouldn't be chasing numbers. We should be chasing the guys that are in the room, and the
right,
guys who aren't in the room. Let's find out why they're not in the room anymore. But to say, oh, we lost 5,000 members from 5 years ago, that kind of mentality that doesn't really work. Acknowledging that is good, but dealing with the numbers, it doesn't lead you to a successful experience.
no, it doesn't. It really doesn't. And thankfully we have somebody like Bob Weatherford going after the the guys that left to find that to find out why they left and try to bring them back.
Sometimes it's just having a conversation, and it's starting that conversation. And then after you have that conversation, it's returning to that brother and continuing to have a dialogue rather
Right,
than just one conversation.
right, for sure. Well, this was good. We made it through with just two of us.
No,
No biscuit.
I think we did a great job. Sometimes you don't need the biscuit. You just need a little side.
Yeah, we laid off the carbs today. Maybe that's what it was. That's a horrible analogy, but
Ooh,
I'm gonna keep it in there just so he can hear it.
keep it in there.
Well, any parting words on this there, Brother Chris?
No, I think this speaks to the types of articles that were in the New Age. Obviously this is
Hmm.
1992, so we are certainly in the 90s now. I think some of the articles where we were working on are the 1904, 1910s.
Pretty early ones, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. So what you'll see, and I'm pleased that we're continuing to do more articles like this. We're going to try to provide you articles from different generations and different time frames and different decades. That way you can see the evolution of what people thought was important to print. So obviously here was an examination on internal self and the ego and how to engage with people. In the past, we've done things on Masonic rings and Napoleon Bonaparte and all these
right.
different things. So I think it shows the wide breadth of the New Age magazine, and that's really one of the reasons why I think I consider it one of the, if not the greatest Masonic publication in the United States regarding American Freemasonry.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And that it was monthly. They were coming up with that content all the time.
Oh yeah, well, it helped to have a dedicated person that works on this, and
Well,
you know,
yeah, that's for sure. That's for
that
sure.
certainly helps.
I'm going to wrap this up. I am Matt Bowers, 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason. We have the Honorable Chris Ruley, 32nd degree KCCH,
Hello.
author, historian, archivist of DC.
Just a guy, just a guy.
Just a dude. Just a dude. Thanks
That's
for listening to the New Age Masonic podcast, and we'll see you all next time.